Hello and welcome. This is Active Inference GuestStream number 91.1 on November 1st, 2024. We're with John Dall'Aglio et al. Discussing dual aspect monism and the free energy principle. We'll have a presentation by John followed by a panel discussion. So thank you all for joining, and John for the presentation. To you.
Okay, thanks, Daniel, and thanks very much to Active Inference Institute for hosting this, and thank you so much to all of my colleagues and people I very much look up to, and such brilliant figures in the field for joining for this. So I'm going to be speaking about the free energy principle and dual aspect monism, specifically from a Lacanian neuropsychoanalytic perspective. And I'll say a little bit about what kind of background I'm bringing from the Lacanian viewpoint. It's a particular school of psychoanalysis that has mostly engaged less with contemporary natural sciences. And I think that this engagement is very fruitful and introduces some not necessarily new ideas, but different sort of angles and perspectives. And so I'm really much hoping for a discussion and around these ideas. But to begin with a joke that maybe illustrates some of the ideas. This is a joke for the Hegelian subject, but I think it would equally apply to the Lacanian subject. As the Lacanian subject or Hegelian subject, not as something that is a simply straightforward conscious being, but a certain self-contradiction or a certain self-loop of the diverting out of one's own self. And so the joke goes that the subject emerges precisely by way of a reflective, self-relating reapplication of a logical operator, as in the worn-out joke about the cannibal who ate the last cannibal in the tribe. These sort of twists show up in a lot of the sort of philosophy behind here, but I think that the ideas link quite well to some of the computational concepts that I'll be talking about. So with that, these are some of the sources I'm drawing on. This is a book recently published. I'm very grateful for Mark and Karl for such kind endorsements, and an article that recently came out in the journal Neuropsychoanalysis, discussing some of these ideas in a little more specific philosophical depth. But to begin, I begin with Solms's work on dual aspect monism, and just to give the background, dual aspect monism is a philosophical position coming from Spinoza, where it doesn't posit some sort of dualism from the Cartesian tradition. Rather, there's just sort of one stuff in nature. I'm calling it thing in nature, but there's just kind of one thing. Freud called it the mental apparatus, and this is the monism part of it. And the dual aspects come from the fact that we have two vantage points for this one part of nature. You can look at this part of nature as a subject with thoughts, feelings, and the like. And you can look at this part of nature as an object, the brain, the thing that you can poke, squeeze, measure, all of those things. And the idea is that neither is more real than the other. These are two perspectives of the same unique part of nature. It's not like the liver, which does all wonderful things of filtering toxins out of the body, but presumably there's not something it's like to be a liver, in the way that there's something it is like to be the brain, that there is a subjective experience that the brain has, and likewise, there's a subjective vantage point on this thing in nature. Let me just okay, great. So these are two lenses. Neither is necessarily more real than the other. But interestingly, this leaves this kind of question of, okay, well, then what is this thing in nature? How can we describe this thing in nature if it's neither physiological nor subjective? What is it then? And recent work has argued and tried to apply the free energy principle to characterizing the nature of this ontology. to characterize the nature of nature, so to speak. And the argument is that ultimately, for any what's called a self-organizing system, any system which is bound by a barrier that distinguishes system from not system, obeys what's called Friston's law. And Friston's law, as everyone here knows, is that all quantities within the system that can change will change to minimize free energy. Minimizing free energy being a way of saying there's a minimization of uncertainty, there's a minimization of entropy, a minimization of error signals, essentially. And I realize there are some mathematical differences, but this is the general picture. So the argument is that this thing here can be characterized as obeying these sort of informatic principles of minimizing uncertainty, minimizing surprise, and all of the operations here can likewise be characterized as changing in order to deal with free energy. So that being said, I want to take this and think through Mark Solms's recent work on the hard problem of consciousness, and specifically his arguments for what then are the necessary mechanistic features for a conscious self-organizing system. So not just sort of things in nature in general, but specifically this part of nature that has this very remarkable quality of being conscious. And how do we characterize this? How do we understand it from a free energy principle perspective? And so the first main point is that within this system, there are multiple categories of homeostatic demand. And here, the main references are innate categories of especially emotional homeostasis, but not only, also bodily homeostasis. For example, viable bounds for blood sugar levels, for sodium concentrations, but also more socio-emotional things like it is good for the system for the organism to be close to caregivers. It is good to avoid threats to life and limb. In the prehistoric jungle, when the prehistoric tiger is running at the poor prehistoric human, the one who has wants to avoid said prehistoric tiger is going to survive. It's going to maintain the integrity of the system. And so the argument is that within this system, especially in mammalian brains, there are many of these categories. I'm not going to list all of them. Perhaps we can talk about them later if it becomes relevant. But there are these different systems that are different affective qualities. I've mentioned a few, say attachment demands, say demands for engaging with novelty, say demands for staying safe from threats to harm. And computationally speaking, all of these systems function as what's called hyperpriors, or innate prior predictions. So within the model, these are predictions that, one, the organism is born with, and two, they can't change. So you can't change your set point for temperature bounds, because if you do, then you dissipate, and proteins don't like that. And likewise for these socio-emotional homeostats of saying it is good to stay close to caregivers. These hyperpriors do not change, and so the system has to deal with them. It has to sort of reckon with the fact of these things. And therefore, in the very chaotic context of existing, not only in the prehistoric jungle, but also in the complicated interpersonal social life that humans especially find themselves in, there are many different contexts, and more specifically, many unpredicted contexts. There's no way that evolution could have predicted that we'd be living in the current kind of society we're living in. That's not sort of encoded into the genome. But what this means is that there has to be some mechanism within the brain for prioritizing which category am I going to focus on or allow to sort of guide my predictive cascades in this given context. In this given situation, am I going to follow hunger predictive cascades? Am I going to, I might be hungry right now, but I'm having some sort of thing I want to say, so I'm prioritizing something else. When you are holding a hot cup of coffee, but you have a goal of wanting to not spill that because you know that might be frustrating you, then you tolerate the pain that you feel from the hot cup of coffee in your hand. Rather than following the pain cascade to release the hand and drop it, you are sort of following a different line of predictions for a moment. When the child is faced with the conflict of, okay, my loving, caregiving caregiver is not doing what I want them to do right now. That's making me a little angry. I'm actually feeling like I want to destroy and attack this caregiver. But oh no, that doesn't line up well with my demands to stay close and sort of stay protected by this caregiver. If I destroy the caregiver, then there's no one for me to be close to. So I have to choose which one am I going to prioritize, especially in unpredicted contexts. Within that prioritization is the capacity for choice. There's the capacity to have voluntary action at this basis. So these five features are what Mark has argued are the sort of core features of an affectively conscious self-organizing system. And it's within this model that I want to think about, okay, what does the Lacanian perspective kind of add to this? And specifically, how does this open questions for thinking about the free energy principle as we apply it to how we think about especially human ontology? Within this, we can say, however, that all of these mechanisms, all of these functions that are necessary for there to be affective consciousness, that sort of subjective quality of feeling of what it is like to be conscious, which is a certain kind of feeling state, all of those obey Friston's law. That is, the prioritization function operates in order to minimize free energy. And how does it do it? This is the argument that affective consciousness corresponds to precision modulation. So there are not only within the free energy principle, as again we all know, predictions and prediction errors. These are all weighted by precision weights. Basically, the confidence in how confident am I that this prediction will minimize free energy. Likewise, how salient are these prediction errors? Should I be attending to them or not? Can I just dismiss them? And the precision weights are modulated depending on which of the homeostatic systems gets prioritized. So, for example, to go back to the poor child who has to deal with conflicts of rage and attachment, prioritizing rage adjusts different predictions that are more likely to minimize the prediction errors relating to rage, the frustrations around that. Attack, destroy, cry, complain, teeth, and things like that. Versus attachment, prioritizing attachment needs would lead to a different modulation. Different precision weights would be increased, others would be decreased, that are associated with more affiliative or bonding cascades. And when it comes to situations of uncertainty, where the organism does not know what to do, the prioritization here allows one, and this is the argument for why affects are conscious, or why this precision modulation is conscious, is that feeling one's way through one's predictions. It's not just that the precision weights change. That's the sort of what we see thinking from it objectively. But when we think about it subjectively, this is just feeling. When you feel your way through your predictions, you're able to feel, okay, this feels better, good in a certain way. This feels bad, worse in a certain way. This allows me to sort of feel my way through conditions of uncertainty. When I don't know what to do and I have to create, I have to explore, I have to invent, I use affect as a guide. and this is the homeostatic function of affect, and it is in this way that affect facilitates the minimization of free energy in the long term for the system. This idea of feeling one's way through one's predictions. Okay, so thinking philosophically here, then, what this position argues is that Friston's law and the formulas of the free energy principle explain the operations of the mental apparatus, that ontological level, in both of its appearances. In both subjectively, it explains the qualia and subjective experience of affective consciousness, and objectively, it explains various neuronal dynamics, neurocascades, specifically neuromodulatory control of postsynaptic gain via these four homeostatic command systems. And what this allows us to sort of try to begin furnishing, I think this is what's so exciting regarding the philosophy of the free energy principle, is that we can begin to articulate what I'm calling an informatic ontology, one that is neither physiological nor subjective, but this something else of what it is, it has something to do with information. It has something to do with minimizing uncertainty and how we go about dealing with uncertainty. Okay. What does Lacan have to do with any of this? And so Lacan was a French psychoanalyst who is very famous for arguments around language, arguing that one of perhaps his most famous argument is that the unconscious is structured like a language. And this leads to many arguments, and Lacan was notoriously known, and Lacanians today are even more notoriously than Lacan, I think, known for being remarkably anti-naturalist. But this is maybe an illustrative quote. So this is from an interview, I think when Lacan was at MIT, or I think somewhere in the States. We think with our brains. Personally, I think with my feet. That's the only way I really come into contact with anything solid. I do occasionally think with my forehead, but only when I bang into something. But I've seen enough EEGs to know that there's not the slightest trace of a thought in the brain. This is not the only comment Lacan makes like this, but it carries a certain sentiment that, for sort of background for this audience, which I know may not necessarily be Lacanian, but Lacanian psychoanalysis is very, this perhaps characterizes most Lacanians as sort of not really interested in engaging with the brain, that it's simply not relevant. What we care about is language, and that's all we care about. And it's unfortunate because this really obscures a lot of points Lacan made, and it really misunderstands, I think, how Lacan thought about language. And I think how Lacan thought about language is actually incredibly conciliant with the free energy principle and this idea of information. So this is a quotation from Lacan commenting on Freud's project for a scientific psychology. And this is a drawing of that Freud has there on the neurons. And commenting on Freud's use of thinking about neurons and trying to think through this attempt to furnish a psychology for neurologists and so on, Lacan says, it is this idea of neurons that gives value to atomistic theories. The latter do not cover any of those things they claim to cover, namely a certain number of atoms of the neuronic apparatus, supposedly individualized elements of the nervous system, neurons again. But on the other hand, the theories of and relations of contiguity and continuity illustrate admirably the signifying structure as such, insofar as it is involved in any linguistic operation. So what Lacan is saying here is that these individualized elements, the sort of reductionist, one might even say, approach of atomistic theories of the nervous system, actually illustrates what he is thinking about through the lens of language and linguistics. I think this is quite different from saying that it's language per se. And this is a quote from Seminar 20. I say that the unconscious is structured like a language, and I say like so as not to say, and he says all the time, that the unconscious is structured by a language. The unconscious is structured like the assemblages in question in set theory, which are like letters. I'm not going to go into Lacan's quasi-mathematics here. But the idea here is that what is it? The emphasis is on the word like. It's not what language is by language, English, German, whatever it might be. It is what is the nature of language, and specifically language as a differential system of contiguous and continuous relations. And Lacan argued, proposed, or at least was open to the idea that this can be applied to the brain. Again, when he's commenting on the project, in orientation to the object, the regulation of the threat, the ideational representatives relate to each other in accordance with the laws of memory organization, a memory complex, a facilitation, or a concatenation, and I emphasize here, whose neuronic apparatus perhaps allows us to glimpse those operations in a material form, and whose functioning is governed by the law of the pleasure principle. Again, and I think this is quite clearly showing how it's not an emphasis on, okay, no, it's only about language. It's an emphasis on, okay, these what linguistic operations, contiguity, continuity, can be glimpsed and can appear likewise in the operation of the brain, i.e. the neuronic apparatus here. And more specifically, governed by the law of the pleasure principle, which today we can understand as the law of free energy minimization. And one last quote from Lacan, because I think it's so remarkable here. This is again in Seminar 20, and he's commenting on the status of information theory in natural sciences at the time in the early 70s. And he's talking here that we're at the level of the gene's molecular information and the winding of nuclear proteins around strands of DNA that are themselves wrapped around each other, double helix and all of that. And all of this being tied together and sent via hormonal links. In other words, messages that are sent, recorded, and so on. Let us note that the success of this formula finds its source in a linguistics that is not immanent, but explicitly formulated. Not only immanent, but explicitly formulated. In any case, this action extends right to the very foundations of scientific thought, being articulated as, and I emphasize, negative entropy, a negentropic function, again, a resistance of dissipation toward entropy of the system. So even at the level of DNA, what Lacan is saying is you can see something linguistic here. Surely there's not speech at the level of DNA in the sense of literal language being exchanged, as in what I'm saying right now. However, it's the logic of communication theory that is relevant here. And so what we can say then is that when the symbolic or the system of language that is referred to in Lacanian theory, what this refers to is some kind of linguistic organization, a relation of different elements that are continuous in a chain, ones that relate to each other, ones that are anticipatory, one anticipates the next, that revolve around a certain antagonism, contradiction, or inconsistency. And this is where the particular Lacanian twist, I think, comes in. It's that, and this is what Lacan means by the real, that within any symbolic system, whether that's actual spoken language or the systems of DNA communication or the neuronal atomistic elements within the brain, that there's some inconsistency, some tension that prevents a perfect settling of the system. It prevents a full sort of resolution where there would be no, let's say, uncertainty, where there would be no antagonism or tension or arousal. And importantly, this inconsistency is not some wound or imperfection to be remedied or healed or done away with by good enough adaptation, by correction or sort of thing. It's something that's at the core of one's being. And Lacan terms this neologism extimate, condensation of exterior, intimate, external, internal. And the idea is that what is most foreign to us, what is most alien to our sense of ourselves, is simultaneously what is at the core of ourself. It is simultaneously what is most precious, what is most essential to how we think, our conscious self-reflective experience, our, let's say, egoic experience, or even our symbolic sense of where we stand in our organization. So how can we then conceptualize this idea of a constitutive inconsistency within some sort of communicative or informatic system, within this model that Solms has put forward regarding affective consciousness, free energy minimization, and the like? First, this requires a crucial philosophical shift. And this is implicit for some, not for others, but it bears help by stating it explicitly. And this is what I'm calling, following Adrian Johnston, sort of what's called capital N nature. And this idea of capital N nature is an idea that the laws, whatever those laws might be in nature, are fully determinate, in that they fully determine the behavior of material particles, they fully determine what happens by stuff, generally and simply speaking. And two, they are seamless. In other words, they're non-conflicting. They sort of govern in a sort of idealized fashion all of the operations of whatever there might be. And in a wonderful exchange between Friston and I forget which journal, it was a philosophical critique of the free energy principle, saying that, okay, you're just saying everything's Markov blankets, so then you get to use the free energy principle to explain everything. And I think the response was wonderful. It was like, yes, it is all Markov blankets all the way down. And one way of potentially reading that, and in this preprint that you can find from Karl Friston, is that this sort of the mathematics that follow from delineating things, self-organizing systems as delineated by the possession of a Markov blanket, means that you can actually apply this from the very tiny things of quantum mechanics all the way up through to the macro scale of classical mechanics. And the argument here, and this would be an anti-reductionist's nightmare, is that all of the behavior of these systems, from very small to very large, can be subsumed within a seamless chain of free energy minimization, of obeying something like Friston's law as it gets applied in these different states. And I am not by any means an expert on the mathematics here, so I welcome any corrections on that point. But I think the fear for some would be that, okay, you're saying everything can be reduced to free energy minimization. And then this leads some people to then say, okay, well, no, there exists something that defies a reduction in this way, and we can maybe talk about it in a somewhat mystical way, as being or something purely negative or transcendental like that. Now, the alternative that I want to put forward is that this is not the only way to think about nature. And this is the perspective from Adrian Johnston, what he calls transcendental materialism and weak nature, so to speak. And weak nature refers to the idea that, and it's a materialist philosophical position, there are only natural material phenomena. There is no special transcendental subjectivity that only exists because we speak. There is no sort of special quasi-dualist, but you don't want to say the word dualist sort of a thing, that defies capture by any sort of natural science or any sort of material theory. There are only these phenomena. However, the laws that govern nature are not seamless. They are not fully able to assert themselves, and especially they do not sit in a perfect harmony with each other. What I'm calling weak laws, in contrast to strong laws that fully determine and line up in a perfect mathematical equation, weak laws conflict with each other, and because of that conflict, fail to fully assert themselves. And therefore, and this is how the sort of transcendental dimension comes in here, the more than natural, quote unquote, phenomena that are traditionally described as something transcendental, like human subjectivity, they emerge not in a deterministic fashion out of the lower levels, but they emerge out of the conflicts and antagonisms of those lower levels. the points where weak laws come into rift with each other, where they bump up, those points are points of non-determinate emergence, because they're not emerging from points where determination is working the way it would. It comes sort of the logic of an accident, the logic of emergence from something that's not working, an emergence from some sort of antagonism. And a way to kind of put this formulaically, complexity breeds negativity. This negativity of what's sort of not positivistically determined. As things get more complex, there are more opportunities and more risks of things short-circuiting, and more room for things to go wrong. And by go wrong, this means something new happens, and this sort of emergence by surprise. And you can think about this. This is a wonderful book by Daniel Milo. That sometimes we think of evolution as this strong force of adaptation. It's the evolutionary bar to survive and reproduce is a relatively low bar. You can have lots of things inherited. Think of the number of genetic diseases that get passed down because and they're not ideal. Those are not adaptive. Those are not the best for minimizing uncertainty and preserving the state of the system. Nevertheless, you just need to live long enough to survive and reproduce according to evolutionary law. It's not a strong law in the sense of producing a perfectly adaptive brain, or a brain without conflicts that, as long as they don't severely undermine this reproductive and survival capacity, they can slip by. And on the psychoanalytic or Freudian side, this is the argument, and this is not only my argument, this is or from folks who work in neuropsychoanalysis. This is arguments from within purely Freudian psychoanalysis as well. When Freud tries to argue for a beyond the pleasure principle, the sense of a death drive, a drive toward inertia, a drive toward sort of repetition as an innate feature, in a way, he sort of props up the pleasure principle as then working to do its thing, and then, okay, no, when the pleasure principle doesn't, work, it's because there's some death drive interfering. And this is the contrast argument that, no, there is no beyond the pleasure principle. This I'm taking from Jonathan Lear. There is just the pleasure principle, but the pleasure principle is itself prone to faults, repetitions of prior satisfactions leading it astray, and so on. Simply put, the pleasure principle does its thing, but it doesn't do it perfectly. It's not a strong law. The law of the pleasure principle is, quote unquote, a weak law. So I argue that we can find this kind of logic at this point within the model that Solms has put forward. So within here, there is the presence of multiple categories of homeostatic demand that have to be contextually prioritized in conditions especially of uncertainty. What this is saying is that within the brain, within the level of innate hyperpriors within the predictive model, there are conflicts. There is antagonism. I gave just one example, the conflict between attachment and rage, where you want to remove frustrations to your goals. These conflicts can easily be multiplied among even just various socio-emotional systems, let alone when we get into the problem of having to think about the fact that other self-organizing systems themselves have innate hyperpriors, and they kind of depend on them to help me with my stuff, so I need to take that into account. There's all sorts of opportunities for conflict. And not only that, within this model, these different systems cannot be equated into one common denominator. There is no sort of equation to say, okay, 7/10 of seeking equals 3/4 of rage equals 5/10 of fear. So you can add that up to get, I don't know what the math would be, but whatever 20th% of total overall free energy. That equation can't happen because these are innate, categorically distinct hyperpriors. lives. What you need to do to deal with attachment needs differs from what you need to do to deal with hunger, differs from what you need to do to deal with needs to explore and engage with novelty and uncertainty. So whichever, and you have to prioritize one, because if not, then you're just sort of helpless before this chaos. But in prioritizing one, you are necessarily leaving something else uncertain, leaving some residual surprise or free energy elsewhere, because these cannot be fully subsumed under one category. And so it is because of this innate conflict, this innate antagonism, that there is affective consciousness. Affective consciousness as the need to feel your way through uncertainty, to feel your way through the predictions you're employing in, okay, I don't know which to prioritize here. I'm going to prioritize this, but I'm not quite sure what to do. And then I'd have to kind of feel what feels a little better, what feels a little worse. This depends on contradiction. This depends on this innate conflict between categorically distinct domains of free energy, all within a single complex self-organizing system. Now, on the computational side, even though, yes, it is the case that the brain does compute an overall measure of quote-unquote total free energy or domain general free energy, this does not eliminate the difference between these domain-specific categories of free energy. Just because the number is calculated to allow computations and allow action perception cycles to occur, to not sort of just leave everything at a halt, so to speak. This should not be read as doing away with this difference at the level of the innate informatic ontology. That calculation facilitates adaptive functioning, facilitates moving through the world, but it doesn't undo the fact that, no, there is this conflict. It's not a conflict that is remedied. It's one that is a constant sort of tension that persists. And so, just going back to this sort of diagram here, what we see is not simply that there's just some simply existing thing there. It's not just some system which does its thing of minimizing free energy. Well, no, there's actually already there some sort of antagonism or conflict that problematizes a straightforward application of Friston's law. It problematizes in the sense that, well, we're in situations all the time where it's not clear what to do, let alone which systems to prioritize to perfectly minimize free energy. And psychoanalytic clinical phenomena testify to this, I think, in a very clear fashion. So I just want to close on the main sort of questions I have and sort of ideas I have that I'm hoping we can discuss in addition to anything else that comes up. But I really want to, I'm curious, and I really think, you know, what are really like the consequences for a self-organizing system which contains categorically distinct and contradictory domains of free energy? What does it mean to think about the free energy principle where there is this sort of necessary rift within a conscious system of different hyperpriors that don't seamlessly fit together. They don't form a harmonious whole, and this leaves a certain necessity for conflict. What does it mean for a system to obey Friston's law when the elimination of free energy is impossible if these innate categories of free energy conflict with each other in this fashion? And then that's the key point. It's not that minimizing free energy is just because the environment is complicated, although it is, and this introduces all sorts of complications. But it's also this innate architecture of affective consciousness, where you have these different domains of free energy, where sort of almost by definition, moving down one path means that there's some residual or surplus of free energy somewhere else. Hence, we continue to be conscious. Hence, we never eliminate our background minimal level of uncertainty that's palpating through the hierarchy. In other words, what does it mean when the system's efforts to minimize free energy inevitably produce free energy? And this would be, again, the sort of Lacanian twist that I'm coming from without stating all of the Lacanian theory here, that language itself produces its own excesses. It produces its own uncertainties. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, John.
Shall I stop sharing?
Sure. Okay, whoever is moved to, let us begin with some initial comments from the panel.
Thank you, John, very much. I'll dare to start with some very small remarks. The first and probably the main remark is that I fear that we are not going to find anything to disagree about. So how are we going to have an interesting discussion if we all see things the same way? So hopefully I will be able to find something to disagree with you about. And so in that spirit, let me make one or two further remarks. You invoke my argument that the different needs of a complex organism have to be treated categorically. They have to be treated as categorical variables, not as it happens because they require you to do different things and those different things conflict with each other, but because each of them have to be met in their own right. That's the crucial point, that it doesn't help to reduce the total quantity of free energy if you leave out one of the categories. In other words, you always have to breathe, as well as drink, as well as sleep, etc. So it's in this sense that it's obligatory that they be treated as categorical variables. In other words, 8 out of 10 of sleepiness and 8 out of 10 of thirst are not the same thing. They are qualitatively different. And incidentally, that for me is the ground zero of qualia. It's why we have to have different qualities in the mind. So you invoke that argument of mine, and I'm very glad to be cited in that way. But I just want to make the point that you don't need to invoke that argument of mine, which is, as it were, built upon or even imposed upon Karl's a bigger, deeper free energy principle. I think that it's inherent in Karl's own ideas. For example, just to mention one, and really I could think of a few, but the inherent antagonism between complexity and accuracy. You could have cited that example, which is really a pretty basic principle, a pretty basic part of the standard formalism that's used by people working within Karl's framework. Simply put, in order to maximize accuracy, which is a good thing, you have to increase complexity, which is a bad thing. In order to maximize simplicity, which is a good thing, you have to forfeit accuracy, which is a bad thing. And so there's an inherent antagonism there. And as I say, I could think of several others, but that's enough to make the point. In other words, I want to make the point that it's although I'm glad to be cited in this context, I think that your argument applies to the far more fundamental formulation that Karl has given us. Then one last point, and remember, I'm just trying to get the ball rolling, and I'm trying to find, is there something we can disagree about? I'm no philosopher. By the way, I'm such a badly educated philosopher that I didn't even understand your joke at the beginning about the cannibals. But I'm no philosopher, but the one thing that jarred for me, if I understood you correctly, is that you're recommending that a dual aspect monist metaphysics be replaced by a transcendental materialist metaphysics. I can only assume that's what you're saying, because I don't see how you can reconcile a materialist metaphysics with a dual aspect monist metaphysics. Because the materialist is one side of the dual aspects. So that's the one thing that jarred for me. I think that I cling to a dual aspect monism because we want to find a place in natural science for subjectivity, the fact that it exists. Here we are experiencing it right now. It's part of nature, and we have to find some way of reconciling it with our materialist conception of the universe. And for me, the answer is to recognize that the material perspective is also a perspective. In other words, there too we're dealing with phenomena as observed by sentient minds. The subjective and the objective are both perceptual vantage points upon something which lies beyond both appearances, and that thing which lies beyond both appearances must lie beyond the phenomenal properties of matter. And that's why Karl's whole way of thinking appeals to me so profoundly. The idea. It ultimately goes back Karl's way of thinking to Galileo telling us that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. As I'm speaking, I realize that there's one other thing I might be able to disagree with you about, but let me stop there because I fear I'm not going to be able to find something stronger to disagree with you about than that. Thank you.
Shall I say something, or? So thank you. Thank you, Mark. Perhaps after hearing from some other folks, I'll maybe say more, less a point of disagreement, but more an open question that I have. But at least regarding dual aspect monism and transcendental materialism, my sense is wanting to supplement it, not to replace. And I think this is where there would be a need to re-theorize something in transcendental materialism as it has been theorized, where I don't want to say transcendental informaticism, or I'm also not a philosopher, so I'm not sure how to say it, but basically to apply this way of thinking of weak laws, emergence from conflict, emergence from things not working out, that sort of thing, to how we think about that, whatever that thing is in nature beyond both phenomena. So, but the way that I interpret the materialism in transcendental materialism is perhaps closer to the idea of information, and this is why, like when Lacan says, Lacan will say the materiality of language, and this is a materiality not necessarily like the stuff that I can hold and everything. It's an open question, I think, but Lacan, and he changes how he thinks about that through over time. But in this sense of the idea of communication, the idea of information and negative entropy.
Oh, maybe I can also ask some questions. Thank you, John. First of all, it's such a pleasure to hear you kind of tie together all of these different threads. It's really impressive. The first point I'd like to make is maybe in relation to Adrian Johnston's transcendental materialism. Like, there's in his work also kind of some doubt about how to formulate kind of his own project, I guess. So he has this essay from 2020 called Meta-Transcendentalism and Error-First Ontology, where he says that he's come to consider the descriptive label of critical dialectical naturalism synonymous to, if not preferable to, transcendental materialism. And then he says specifically, because for him, it condenses in a single phrase kind of idealist methodology, and then realist, materialist, naturalist ontology. So I'd be curious if if you have reasons to stick or prefer transcendental materialism, or whether you would consider these interchangeable. And my other question, maybe also as an attempt to, I guess, stir the pot in a way, in terms of finding a point of disagreement between you and Mark. Not for the sake of it, but because that's a question I'm quite interested in. You didn't mention it today, but since it's in the title of Enjoying Uncertainty, I'm curious about this point of Lacanian drive being on the side of increases in tension, and in that sense operating outside or beyond the logic of homeostasis, as I understand it in your work. And I guess, I would like to maybe push back a little bit on that point, to the degree that I wonder whether that kind of resistance towards the concept of homeostasis doesn't have a lot, if not most, to do with kind of Lacan's concept of homeostasis. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in seminar 2 he defines it, or he says something like, homeostasis can mean one of two things. The first is an equilibrium of a system, and the second thing is death. And then 10 years later, like in the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, kind of he repeats these same points. So I don't think it was a quirk of that time. So I do wonder if, like, with the kind of more contemporary concept of homeostasis, including the seeking system and all of the conflicts that arise in that, and that you I think so brilliantly kind of emphasize and put in the forefront, is that rejection or that resistance towards the concept of homeostasis really necessary?
Yeah, thanks, Evert. And this would really be my point for kind of question potential disagreement. That if we then take the next step, it's that at this point that I'm carving of affective consciousness as arising not from free energy minimization, but from the contradiction and conflict of these different not only categories of free energy, but even complexity, accuracy trade-offs within the model, that something else comes up there. And one way to think about it is that, okay, yeah, there's something here having to do with not just trying to minimize uncertainty, and at least this is coming into some more of the clinical theory, but not only about minimizing uncertainty, but finding a way, or the fact that errors and uncertainty is enjoyed in a certain way. And this is Lacan's idea of jouissance, that it's enjoyed not necessarily consciously, but enjoyed in its own unconscious, or it's an enjoyment that can't be experienced as such, the quote unquote strange satisfaction of the symptom that Freud remarks on. But it's this, I wonder, and this is what I was talking about with, okay, what does it mean for a system to try to minimize free energy when it's impossible to reach that until death, as is pointed out, that, yeah, there's something about, I think, a proactive engagement and enjoyment of uncertainty that I'm not quite sure is only seeking. And this is where I'm really curious, because seeking has its own certain qualitative feel to it. This enjoyment of novelty, epistemic foraging, the dog running around in the field and having old fun and whatnot. But that there's also these points where there's some kind of repetition or some kind of either maintenance or increase of free energy that has a certain enjoyment to it, symptomatic enjoyment perhaps, and that, at least from a Lacanian perspective, ultimately the goal is not to minimize that free energy in the sense of remove the tension. The goal is not to get rid of the symptom or to replace the symptom with a better thing or some better, more adaptive plan. It's to sort of confront this logic of, okay, no, there is something at the core of one's being that exists because things don't work. What's a way? What's something that can be done with that? And this is the idea of enjoying one's symptom. And this is where I have questions. Like, I don't know how to think about it necessarily computationally, but what would it be to modulate something, deep predictions in that sense, to modulate them in such a way that they continue to produce free energy, they continue to lead to increases in uncertainty, but in a way that allows the person to kind of find a vivifying dimension to their symptom, to find a vivifying dimension to how they go about managing and enjoying uncertainty, rather than at least the illusion it makes to the system just trying to totally get rid of it in a way. And I think that's where the Lacanian position differs. I think from how you've conceptualized it, Mark, where it's not the idea with illegitimate predictions, prematurely automatized predictions, not only the idea of laying down better ones that can hopefully work and be more adaptive, but also to do something different with the prematurely automatized predictions that sustain ones that are sort of your unique way of dealing with the conflicts of these different categories of free energy, and in that way to do something different with it. But yeah, I'm not sure how that shows up or how that would play out computationally.
I'm going to resist saying anything more until we've heard from Karl.
Yeah, I'm the eldest, so I have to go last, really. But I can't resist slipping in here. Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation, but actually your last response was revealing. So I learned quite a lot in terms of this, what Lacan brings to the table that may have to. Well, I imagine the ambition here is to sort of naturalize that in terms of current thinking about the way we understand sentient behavior and the like. So before I comment upon the two sets of questions, which I thought were fascinating, what I've done, and this is really for Daniel, I've gone through, whilst listening to the talk, identifying papers that you may not have referenced from other literatures that I think lend weight to a number of specific points you made during the presentation. So if there's time at some point close to the end, I've got about 4 or 5, actually 6 papers that you might enjoy reading, completely outside, I think, your sort of sphere of reading, that do pick up on some of the sort of fundaments that you were positing as key parts of the argument. So I'm saying that just to forewarn you that if I can at some point share my screen and just flick through, because I know this has been recorded, then you can go back and have a look to see if anything is interesting, ranging from Gödel's theorem to strange loops. There's a lot of resonance with other formulations outside the sphere in which we're talking. But just to come back to those sort of key issues, perhaps in reverse order. So this notion of enjoying the uncertainty, or enjoying paradoxical increases in free energy. Is there a mathematical formalism that would resolve that paradox, or sort of paradoxical account, that would also accommodate notions of homeostasis as read by Lacan, at the same time could be read in terms of self-organization from a physics perspective, or certainly from a dynamical systems perspective. Two things occur to me. First of all, your repeated account of the going beyond just seeking as one manifestation of this enjoying your uncertainty. I thought was very interesting, because I had assumed when you started answering that this would be exactly the epistemically expected information gain that underwrites behavior. So when people talk about minimizing free energy, that's fine when one's talking about sense making, but when one is talking about how we engage with the world and the decisions and the choices that we make, or the things that we select to do, then one has to think about the expected free energy expected following that choice or decision or act or intention, and from that perspective, that the complexity and the accuracy that Mark was referring to now become risk and ambiguity, or when rearranged, expected information gain versus expected cost. And the expected information gain, I think, does appear to have a lot of simple explanatory capacity in talking about the allure of uncertainty. And you said that beautifully. You talked about novelty seeking, you talked about epistemic foraging, and I was surprised to hear that for you wasn't a sufficient explanation, and perhaps it's because you were associating the epistemic foraging with seeking of a particular sort. But a lot of what you said seems to me to be exactly the notion that we enjoy pushing the boundaries in the fond hope or knowledge that we will be able to resolve that uncertainty and become wiser and more confident in our engagement with the world. And it reminds me very much of an argument put forward for why we actively listen to music. Particularly jazz music, which has that exactly the right kind of predictable unpredictability to keep us engaged. And usually the argument here is that I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know I will know if I keep on doing this. Very much like listening to a joke. I don't know what the punchline is going to be, but I do know that if I commit to this direction of travel, then I will be amused, and and that amusement, that pleasure, will be, if you like, scored by the resolution of uncertainty in a volatile and unknown space environment, in the space of jokes in that instance. So I would, and I won't say anything more about that, but it'd be interesting if you could discuss what is this sort of essence of enjoying uncertainty that is not explained by knowing I'm going to reduce my uncertainty, but first I have to actually put myself in a situation where I'm seeking out those, that potential for resolution of uncertainty about me, about mum, about the jazz music. Mathematically, I'm wondering whether one way of sort of bringing Lacan into the 21st century would be to go back to something I found quite fascinating, which was the two ways of reading homeostasis, as I understand it, from what Evert was saying. Death is certainly one kind of homeostasis, but clearly it's not the kind of homeostasis that we associate with biotic self-organization. And the mathematical distinction between the two is between equilibrium steady states and non-equilibrium steady states. Now, all of physics, and certainly the kind of schoolboy physics you would have been exposed to when talking about thermodynamic free energy minimization, pertains to a point equilibrium. So in the language of dynamical systems theory, we're talking about a point attractor. So at the point you converge to your point attractor, everything ceases. You're dead. You're cold. You're a free energy minimum, and that's a perfectly apt description of closed systems. That is what will happen if you're isolated from the world. But when you're open to the world, across your Markov blanket, for example, then we're talking about a different kind of a non-equilibrium steady state, and this has a characteristic itinerancy. I mean, mathematically, it's and I can't resist slipping this in because it also appeals again to sort of Helmholtzian ideas. But in this instance, it has to be the case in any system that is far from equilibrium or open to an environment that has attained some kind of steady state, i.e. persists and exists. It has to have a solenoidal aspect to it by the Helmholtz decomposition. That is a mathematical truism. Now, there are many ways of reading that solenoidal aspect. It could be a biorhythm, it could be an oscillation, it could be replication dynamics at an evolutionary scale, it could be walking, it could be talking, it could be everything that returns to some point in a weak sense, so it's not exactly, but returns to the neighborhood. And I just pick up on that because of for many reasons, but specifically because of the repetition aspect of this kind of aspect. Of that the phenomenology that you were talking about, where there is exactly this description of the particular itinerancy that characterizes free energy minima that are a result of attaining a non-equilibrium steady state. So you have this itinerancy. There can't be any other way of keeping within an attracting set unless you keep returning to the point, that nearby point that you were once in. So I'm just wondering if you want to go beyond seeking and beyond epistemic foraging, then perhaps what you're saying is, well, yes, but this is in the context that I am on this attracting set that has this quintessentially biotic kind of recurrence or repeatability that gives us an itinerancy at many, many different timescales that makes me the kind of thing that I am, and in this environment in which to which I'm open. So I just put that out there as a possible mathematical metaphor for talking about sort of what Lacan was referring to. If you want a physiological metaphor, I think it's important to actually distinguish now between homeostasis, homeoresis, and allostasis, and alloresis, if there is such a thing. So the distinctions are that the homeostasis is fast reflexive, whereas the allostasis actually has some future pointing aspect to it, so you can plan to be homeostatic. But that in itself is not homeostasis. It brings a certain depth and itinerancy, and one could argue, in virtue of the depth, it takes you much closer to the kind of structures and the reliance upon precision modulation that you were talking to. But there's another axis here, which is the difference between stasis and eresis. So homeoresis is like homeostasis, but for paths. And of course, as soon as we're talking about systems that have itinerant orbits, where you do have to keep revisiting characteristic states of being at many, many different timescales, then the kind of homeostasis you're talking about is now homeoresis, is actually keeping close to that path. And I'm just wondering if Lacan's distinction between the two kinds of homeostasis was really a distinction between mathematical homeostasis, which is a point attractor and death, and homeoresis, which is keeping to a path, or a set of paths that define an orbit, usually chaotic, and it's usually stochastic, but it doesn't have to be. I'm talking far too much. I'm going to go back to the Mark's initial observation, just to celebrate that. In my world, there's a distinction between categorical and continuous variables. And I think Mark was picking up on that, and I think he was absolutely right to do that. I do think that there's a really important role for categorical generative models in relation to the description about sort of symbols and language and sort of carving nature into discrete ways of being. I think that's absolutely essential, and I'm sure you're right that sort of unconscious processing probably takes place under discrete language-like generative models and possibly also conscious processing. But I think that's an orthogonal argument from the notion, the really important notion I thought you were trying to get across, which is that there are multiple constraints that provide another kind of conflict, because I've got sort of multiple dimensions that I have to comply with. It's not just one-dimensional pleasure. There is pleasure in multiple dimensions, and sometimes some of the excursion along one dimension may be more unpleasurable than the excursion along another dimension, and that both of those, if you like, the degree of excursion will be very context sensitive, and hence I now have to prioritize. Do I want to sort of be homoerotic in this dimension or that dimension? And I think Mark was trying to say that it's the multidimensional aspect, that there are more than one discrete dimensions to the way that we have to mathematically, in terms of the extended free energy, evaluate the cost of this particular plan, and that provides a profound departure from things like reinforcement learning, where there's only one dimension. So I've now taken to talking about not expected value or utility, but expected cost, the negative of that. So I can now say that this minimization of expected cost part of the expected free energy is effectively a multiple constraint satisfaction problem, and it's usually, if you read the sort of the maths literature in active inference, that's usually encoded by C. And one of the reasons for C is it stands in for constraints, but it's multiple constraints in every dimension that there exists an outcome. And of course, if you now condition C on some inferred state of being or some context, then you have exactly what you were saying, which is this problem of actually prioritizing this constraint over that constraint. The reason I like the word constraint is that you can now speak to physicists who believe that the free energy principle is dual to James's constrained maximum entropy or caliber principle. The entropy is for points, so that would be the homeostasis. The caliber is for the path, so that would be the homeoresis. So now you've got a way of talking to physicists, because what you're saying is it's all in the constraints. And these constraints are multiple. They're as many dimensional as the dimensionality of the phase space. So again, I'm just trying to sort of enable you to sort of generalize, these really important points in a way that might actually have a relatively simple mathematical basis. In fact, it's almost unavoidable, and certainly that notion of multiple constraints and inducing a kind of conflict, although you are effectively in a multiple constraint satisfaction, resolving that conflict by prioritizing, exactly as you say, those constraints, what could also be called prior preferences. But if you think of a constraint or a cost as a negative prior preference or log preference, then I think that all makes sense. I got so much more to say, but I'm going to stop talking now.
No, thank you, Karl. That's really fascinating, and this helps me, I think, maybe formulate what I'm trying to think through from the Lacan end of things. So I think that I think why there would be some suspicion of the expected free energy calculation as this sort of the enjoying of engaging with novel uncertainty and that sort of thing is because, well, generally when it sounds too adaptive, and Lacanians don't like that. But the idea that the enjoyment doesn't derive from the fact that, okay, I'm going to engage with this uncertainty because, and then I know that I will get that pleasure in the end, and then it will meet that need, that it's almost enjoyment for its own sake. Or the increase of uncertainty almost for its own sake. But what I think would bring it together is that it would be, and my use of the terms might not be correct, technically, but the sort of ways of thinking through the expected uncertainty would be for an anticipated feature that never actually materializes, an anticipated outcome, and this I think would maybe approximate what Lacan calls the fantasy. And specifically the unconscious fantasy, which is not it's not imagistic. It's sort of it's something that is never formulated explicitly, can only be constructed in the course of a treatment. But it's sort of the virtual terminal point upon which various of these scenes of increased repetitions that don't work out. It would be this increase of uncertainty that leads to bad outcomes, that doesn't ultimately to the decrease of free energy, and yet it repeats regardless. And to rationalize that symptomatic, let's say, repetition is by reference to some kind of fantasy formulation of, oh, this is what this is the anticipated outcome that the person had, that gives a little sense to why this repetition was happening, why this repeated increase of free energy, which is this weird kind of enjoyment, without the more as we typically think about in terms of adaptive learning, by evaluating potential costs for different policies and things. And I think that would be potentially one way of bringing those together. And it's the homeoresis idea is very interesting. Where there's this I can find it somewhere, but there's this diagram Lacan has for the drive, and it's he draws it as a loop, as an arrow loop, encircling negativity, encircling something that you never quite hit, and that's why the drive has this repetitive logic, and it repeats, encircles something that it's aiming at but never quite lands on, in part because it has a purely phantasmatic status, that there isn't something that could finally be hit, and hence the repetition continues. So perhaps that would be, I think, I think one way to link link seeking and expected free energy through expected free energy for a future that doesn't exist, nevertheless exists in the unconscious for the subject.
I'll read a question or two from the live chat. Okay. Andrew writes, where do you place the reality principle in your mapping? In Seminar 7, Lacan seems to view it as being in service of the pleasure principle, so is it a lesser priority concept to incorporate here?
Yeah, that's really great. And I think I don't make a huge distinction because of that it's still ultimately in the service of the pleasure principle. But one of the points that is also made is that the reality principle, not only as a sort of self-correcting mechanism in the sense of learning and updating prior predictions based on new experiences in that sense, but also Lacan talks about reality principle as the index to the maintenance of a minimal level of tension in the psyche, the maintenance of from the exigencies of life that cause there to be a certain minimal constant level of tension, and that maintenance being linked to what we've been discussing as this, okay, what does one then do with this sort of necessity of repeating uncertainty that has this, at least subjectively or phenomenologically, this paradoxical component to it.
Awesome. Another question from the chat for you, John, or anyone. Kendra wrote, does affect consciousness itself emerge as a mistake from the complexity of self-organizing system?
If I can speak metaphorically, yes, as a mistake, but it's a good mistake, and it's in the sense of Slavoj Žižek has this thing of, it's something that happens by accident, but then it was something that turned out to be good. You know, you're trying to do something goes wrong, then oh wow, but this is new and unexpected, but it still works in its own way. Like the making of games, novel invention, or the making of in history, you know, different cuisines or different foods or cheeses or wines that emerge because something wrong, a mistake happened in the fermentation process, but oh look, now we have this, and now this is something that's all wonderful. And I think that that's one nice way to think about clinical work. And from a Lacanian perspective, it's that, okay, can something differently be done, or can something new come from this mistake, quote unquote mistake of how one is maintaining a drive circuit or maintaining a certain repetition of uncertainty that still sustains it, but in a different way.
Awesome. Bucky Fuller talked about mystique, and it's sort of a living systems perspective with the error first ontology and the vivifying perspective on the differential, rather than like dust in a motor, which will just inevitably make it more and more off-kilter. How are you going to continue with the work, or where's the book and everything at?
Well, the book is published very thankfully, and I can't say exactly where the next step is, but trying to apply this a little more empirically is my personal hope. Mark, I wanted to invite you. You said that you had a potential point of disagreement, and I just wanted to make sure you could air that.
I think that given the time constraints, I won't go down that particular path, but I'll rather pick up on. I'm also aware that we must leave time for Karl to share his screen, because I too would love to see those references that he has in mind. But so I'll just make one final remark, which has to do with the main thread of disagreement that I'm pleased to see we did manage to find about the equating of jouissance with seeking. And you said almost in passing, and I think almost embarrassedly, you said, well, Lacanians don't like to explain jouissance in this sort of way because it sounds too adaptive. So I want to comment on that. And I saw a little frown on Karl's face when you said that, and I shared the frown without expressing it. So this is what I think. We have to take seriously feelings. Once they evolved, they become part of nature and they do something. They actually have causal powers. And I think that, that we all too easily forget that. Now, the feeling of lust, clearly the adaptive, or in other words, why it was selected in, why such a feeling evolved, is because it encourages us to perform sexual acts, which ultimately result in reproduction and therefore in the survival of our species. But that's not what motivates each sentient subject to have sex. What motivates us is the feeling, and the feeling. Very frequently, we want the pleasure without reproducing. We're hoping not to reproduce. So the feeling has motivational power, has causal power, all of its own, quite independently of the adaptive mechanisms whereby it evolved. Now, all I wanted to say is the same applies to seeking. Seeking evolved for the very good reasons that we've been discussing, that it is positively a good thing in terms of long-term free energy minimization, to positively engage with uncertainty and to increase your free energy in the process. But the feeling has the same relationship to that. The feeling, in other words, the in my view, the feeling that Lacan's talking about, the enjoyment of the increased attention, the feeling exists in its own right and has its own status. And so you don't know, I am engaging with uncertainty now because in the long run, this is going to reduce my free energy. Not at all. You're just engaging with uncertainty because it's nice. And so it feels good. You know not why. And I still find that the most satisfactory explanation for the phenomenon that Lacan is trying to explain there. Thanks. I've enjoyed this conversation very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Evert, any last words? And then, Karl, you can share your screen.
Yes, thank you, Evert. I thought this discussion was great. I'm also really interested in this point of how expected free energy may accommodate the phenomena that you describe in Lacanian terms, especially maybe when we're dealing with expected free energy, not just in the sense of what will happen based on my current beliefs, but maybe especially once you get to the more complicated schemes, for example, in the case of Professor Friston's sophisticated inference, where it's not just a matter of what will happen based on what I believe, but also what will I believe based on what happens. Please correct me if I hope I don't butcher it now, but like where the whole cascade gets more and more complicated and kind of disconnected from the present as it proceeds. That's what I wanted to add.
No, you didn't butcher it at all. It's very sophisticated to mention sophisticated inference. I'm wondering whether the point that Mark was alluding to there is that all the ingredients that go into the computation of an expected free energy, and it's just interesting to note that some of these ingredients emerge as things called intrinsic motivation in neurorobotics. So when you're actually if you're looking for attachment theory with robots, there are people who do this a lot, and they understand that the seeking part of a certain kind, a very elemental kind, in terms of intrinsic motivation, which I also find quite nice. Sorry, but what I was going to say was the evaluation of all of these moving parts that contribute to the different and potentially conflicting aspects of the composition of the expected free energy rest upon the precision, which brings us back to the precision. Now, that doesn't come from magic, it has to come from your generative model. So there has to be a state of mind that can prescribe and implement and switch on the right precisions in this context, in exactly the way that I think both John and Mark were talking about. And I think it's at that level, or possibly even a meta level above, that the feeling gets into the game. So it is not the intrinsic motivation in and of itself that is felt. It is all the enabling of the prioritization via the precisions that will nuance what is intrinsically motivating, what compels me to seek, what compels me to, and so on and so forth. And I recognize that this particular profile of precision is mine, and it is associated with this deployment of the precision and the activation of the mechanisms that would be required to modulate that. So I think the feeling could be completely divorced from the actual expected free energy, in the sense that even if my expected free energy was non-adaptive, in the sense I have absolutely no idea what to do next. I'm bored. There's no more epistemic value in this environment. I have no preferences. I just don't know what's going. What to do next. I may actually see that as a displeasurable thing or a pleasurable thing, simply because in order to set that profile, I've had to induce a particular precision which is apt for this particular context. So I think that that metacognitive or deep aspect where you need to have that particular depth to your self morals in order to specify what precision is up to this moment may be something that is, allows you a little bit of latitude in terms of feeling good about what is completely maladaptive, and vice versa. I don't know. I suspect that in part was a point that Mark was making.
Do you want to share your slides or papers, Karl? And then that will be.
I do, but I can see it's 3 minutes past. I could just do this for John and Mark if we're over time.
Just do it.
Just do it. All right. Let's just go and. Yeah, I should apologize. I feel a bit naive now. I clearly did not understand the repetition compulsion and Lacanian. I have to think more about that. So yeah, share screen. Let's go to share screen.
In the live chat, Karl, we're trying to understand whether reading your papers, is it only about the value of the information?
And the expected cost, of course. In fact, yes. So here we were. So this is documentary proof that I have now taken to referring to prior preferences as expected cost, so that you can use this phrase multiple constraint satisfaction, where the cost, if like, scores the constraints. And just to re-emphasize, it's a multi-dimensional, has many dimensions, as there are outcomes that one could possibly sense, measure, infer, or observe. So this is from the most recent description of the expected free energy in biological psychology from the supervised structure learning. And that's there we are. What I thought was just coming back to this, the original joke about the cannibal having eaten the last cannibal on the island. I thought that the story was going to be unpacked in terms of the inability of ourselves to represent ourselves, and I'm just compelled by Chris Field's work in this space, where he stays close to the physics, in his own words, to demonstrate that self-representation at some level of recursion and some level of depth is a mathematical impossibility. So I just wondered whether that was what was being intimated by that joke. It transpired that it probably wasn't so important to the central argument, but I just put this paper up by Chris Fields and Michael Evin just as a recent treatment of this from the point of view of the physics. There is also a treatment of this from the point of view of consciousness, where in a slightly more narrative form, this impossibility of seeing oneself or representing oneself at a certain depth or recursion or sophistication in an economic sense inherits from the notion of an irreducible Markov blanket that can't be subdivided on the inside. So the only way that this particular irreducible Markov blanket or system in the brain, which could be distributed and would certainly include the sources of neuromodulation in the spirit of Mark's thesis, which is explicitly mentioned in this paper, the only way that it can see itself is by acting upon the rest of the brain, for example. That action can only be through deploying precision. So I thought there was a nice point of contact between the purely mathematical treatment of self-representation and how it might be unpacked. This is a paper which has gone through many versions, but talks about the inner screen model of consciousness, which is on archives. First author Ramstead, but Chris was a key author of on that. No, that was just reiterating. Oh yes, talking about sort of weak laws could be read in many different ways, and one aspect of this could be that we're not talking about deterministic systems, we're talking about stochastic systems that can only be described probabilistically. Another aspect of this is the departure from deterministic systems as we move into real, or certainly from the physics perspective, biotic systems that have a chaotic aspect that is often called or has a mathematical characteristic of strangeness, which is exploited in this treatment of strange particles with a sort of rather with poetic license, also a reference to the strange loop of Hofstadter, but in this instance speaking exactly to this recurrence. So I now appreciate this is not quite the repetition compulsion, it's more fundamental, but the recurrence that we were talking about before in terms of revisiting states that one once was in. But also it's unpacked in a particular way in terms of what the physics brings to the table in terms of different kinds of things. And noticing that it is certainly possible to infer your own actions, and that may be the first step towards a very deep model, towards this irreducible Markov blanket, where we can no longer represent ourselves, but certainly can, at subsequent or lower levels, have a mechanism for understanding the feelings read as mental actions on the remainder. So this is a paper by me with strange things in the title. This, oh dear. This site, yeah, all right. This one was interesting. I'd read this with care, but it does provide you an entree into into a literature which actually, in this instance, comes from fintech or financial, from formal theories in finance and the like. But it has two aspects which I thought were interesting. First of all, it sort of reiterates the focus that at the end of the day we are quantum, or we can be read as quantum systems, so that things have a language-like property in the sense that they have a certain discreteness. And secondly, the implications for that, taking a slightly different view from Chris Fields, when it comes to representing self, and important aspects of representing self are not just in terms of self-modeling and the ensuing mechanisms for feelings, but in the immune system, and being able to recognize that this cell, this antigen belongs to me, or it belongs to a virus, is a really important aspect of self-representation, self-recognition. So I just put this paper up by Sherry Marcos, who is a fascinating writer, but I repeat, this is difficult stuff, but it does highlight biotic elements have unique digital identifiers with gene codes executing 3D self-assembly for morphology and so on. And her argument uses the recursive operation of self-reference by appeal to Gödel, or you can read that, Gödel's formulation of sentences and the implications of self-replication, self-representation. The interesting thing is that she takes the argument from maths, applies them to the thymic self in the spirit of immunology, but then takes it into the realm of mirror neurons, which is getting slightly closer to don't leave that one. Yeah, just a couple of notes, just to say that the early work speaking to the importance of neuromodulation and precision has a lot of empirical backing in terms of certainly dopamine encoding the precision of beliefs about what I'm going to do next that have this categorical aspect. So there's a lot of work suggesting that certainly things like dopamine have a profound role in the feelings associated with things like seeking. This is the work of a group of people who are committed to understanding phenomenology in a sort of philosophical sense that highlights, and I'm sure you know about this, but really does highlight the importance of precision, and specifically conditioning precision on higher level representations of self, here referenced in terms of hidden mental states, that themselves are updated in accord with fairly more or less precise beliefs whose precision themselves are encoded by a high level. So this is one example of this contextualizing by being able to recognize yourself in certain states of mind, either subpersonally or not, that are associated with the deployment of precision at lower levels, and so on all the way up until you reach this irreducible Markov blanket. So this is work, high level states, condition the likelihood mapping precision at the level below. So I thought this was if you did want to sort of formalize this and start to simulate these things, this is the kind of model I think you'd refer to. And Lars Sandford Smith is a sort of one of the key authors in that space. So towards a computational phenomenology of mental action. Take that right. And then finally, oh yeah, we don't need to worry about that, but I just put that up to remind myself that more recent leveraging of these discrete state space models now can be read purely in terms of inductive inference of a logical symbolic sort, which, if you like, is another way of motivating the importance of this language-like way in which we build beliefs about what we are going to do, that can be read at one level when they're very precise as intentional behavior. So I thought that might be an interesting endorsement of the some of the points that were being made earlier on. And I would stop my sharing. That was it.
Thank you all.
Wonderful, Karl. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Good luck with everything, John. Thank you all for joining.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, I understand folks have to go. Can I just, at least for recording's sake, if folks have to go, that's fine, just so I can say, and this will help me remind myself what I'm saying.
Yeah, people can depart. People can depart. The
Mm-hmm.
live stream continues. And then, John, if you want to add any closing notes.
Yeah, just so on the adaptive point, and I think that a lot of the resistance is just resistance, even clinically speaking. But I think the trick and the challenge, and I think the papers you referenced and shared, I haven't read them, but I from how you describe them, I think that they would be approaching similar ideas. But the difficulty of again, addressing this point that sort of resists full sort of capture, or resists full sort of resolution or explanation, and how exactly to think about that, especially when, as I said, one will kind of repeat something and it doesn't lead to an adaptive outcome, and yet this continues to repeat. But then what to do with it in a way that allows someone to kind of enjoy a bit differently, or in another way, that I think would be fine to be called adaptive. But again, adaptive maybe in this sense of maintaining these sort of different paths of again error, paths of expected free energy that continue to sort of persist. Yeah, so just to kind of tie that together, I think that's the cannibal who makes the mistake of eating the last cannibal, and then okay, what is he to do now with his oral drive? So I'll stop with that. But thank you again so much. This was really a wonderful treat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.